Okay, so I wanted to do a video about how I use my Midi pedal with Reaper and amp sims. I posted about the whole AFAIK loop idea a while back, but now I've improved upon it, so I thought I'd do a video to explain. First I'll go over how the Midi pedal board itself is set up. So basically I just set all the buttons 1 to 10 to be 101 and so on. So basically so they're easy to remember, but actually you can just use Midi learn, so it doesn't really matter which ones you use. Maybe if some plugin has some built-in like configuration, it might be good to use 100 and something, because I don't think those are normally in use, but I don't think most plugins do anything with Midi unless you specifically tell them to. Then there's the expression pedals, which are set to 7 and 27. Nothing special about those. I think these might be like calibration related, that this starts from 1. Not sure, but it doesn't matter at all in this case at least. Then there's one other difference, that I used 6, 7 and 8 to send program change 1, 2 and 3. This is related to the amp sim switching itself. I'll show that later too. Here in Reaper I have the actual project that I use, and there's 2 tracks, as you can see. This one, for one, I think the Midi device in Reaper sends the control messages even if nothing is recording it normally, but I think you need this separate track so you can use the expression pedals as a wah or whammy or whatever, even volume pedal. So that's why I have it. It's currently set only to monitor and not record, but of course you can set it to record if you want to like record the wah or whatever. So you can also record the MIDI information from it. And why not all the pedal changes too, if you for some reason want to record all the things you do. One side note also, I've noticed that sometimes these expression pedals controls switch around a bit. I think at one point these were 20 and 21 and now the 27 and 7, and I don't think I changed anything. I'm not completely sure what's up with that. But yeah, at least it's related to this Behringer. It might be user error too, not sure. So okay, now I see. Yeah, I need to fix this. Actually, if I go to preset 1, then they're different. Okay, yeah, that explains it. Okay, but yeah, I can just set it in this configuration. Also preset 10, I see. I need to fix those there and then just transmit it. So that's not an issue anymore. But yeah, back to where I was. So basically 2 tracks. You can also hide this track if you like want to make it neater, but then if you're recording it, probably best not to hide it, and I'll explain later why this is mostly like most useful for just doodling around. So it doesn't really matter if there's 2 tracks. But yeah, here's all the effects, and as you can see there's an absolute ton of different effects here. I think 39 it said in the performance menu. So basically the reason for that is like the biggest reason, of course I need to like run all the effects and whatnot, but the system I built works so that these FX loops, like normally everything comes in is it called track or channel? Channel, I believe. Channel 1 and 2, and then the signal passes through normally. But these FX loops do it so that the channel switches from 1 to 2 to 5 and 6, and here it comes from 5 to 6 back to 1 and 2. So since these plugins like this one is only listening to 1 and 2 and outputting on 1 and 2, and the FX loop switches the channels to 5 and 6, it just skips this pedal. So what this means is that when I press 1 on the MIDI board, these are disabled. That's done using here MIDI learn and bypass, and then you just press the button and it learns it. But basically this means that it's no longer going at channel 5 and 6, but instead just passing through at 1 plus 2. So this pedal is now in the signal flow, like in the path of the signal. So that is how these FX loops work. So if they're disabled, the signal goes through the loop, so to say, and if they're enabled, it skips the loop. So what this enables is that if I want to switch the overdrive pedals, for example, I can just add a pedal and put it to the loop, and that's it. It works. Otherwise, I think normally when you use a MIDI pedal like this, you would go to, let's take this Marshall governor, and then same sort of place as I showed with another pedal, and then you need to well, either you scroll down all the way into bypass, or I think you can press this and then probably just hit learn, and then it will enable MIDI learn for this bypass, or you can also do this bypass. But that would mean that if you add another drive pedal, you would then have to do the MIDI learn for it. Whereas with the loop, you can just drop it in. So it's sort of a trade-off in that it looks messier, a bit uglier. Maybe at first it's like harder to see what's going on. But on the other hand, adding and switching pedals is easier in this way, which is why I did it like this. And then the amps, these work a bit differently because of course you could do it in a similar fashion, but that would mean that if you switch from, let's say, the clean amp that I'm using to a crunch amp, you would need to enable the clean amp and then disable the crunch amp, and for a moment you would be running two amps at the same time. But instead, like I said, I used the program change at the buttons 6, 7 and 8, which is, you can link to MIDI program change in Reaper, and basically you can see if I press the buttons that it switches the preset. This is actually, I should change the name, but this is actually 11 and 12 instead of 5 and 6, but in any case, this, like the signal comes at 1 and 2 here, and then it's either sent to 11 and 12, so it goes to Plini, or 7 and 8, so it goes through the Vox amp, or 9 and 10 goes to the Granophire. And at the end I have this return mixer that just basically mixes them all down to 1 and 2, back to 1 and 2. You can also see that 3 and 4 is in there, and that is the, oops, yes, sorry. That is the sort of 4 cable noise gate. So basically this plugin doesn't do anything to the signal itself, but it sends it to channels 3 and 4, and I have the actual noise gate. This is just the rear gate, normal stock Reaper gate, and it's using 3 and 4 as the listening channels. So this is basically the noise gate, but it gets its signal it's listening to from before anything. So it always listens to the dry guitar, like DI signal, which is helpful if you have like things with tons of gain and high gain amps, even pedals at the same time, or you have a clean amp and no pedals. So the noise gate would probably need to be set a bit differently, especially if you roll down the volume on your guitar. But in this case I can just use one configuration for everything and it should always work. And I have set the noise gates to 0 at everything, or disabled them in every amp, so the won't be any surprise there. But yeah, to get back to the amps explanation. So basically currently for the amps you need to do configuration. If you switch out an amp, you need to change the channels it's working on. So that is sort of limitation at the moment, but the alternative would be I could like work around that by creating amp effects loop, so to speak, which would always have those channels, but that would mean like 6 more, well, at least 3 more. Not sure if you can do it with 3 and then the return mixer, but I decided to do it this way to like keep the clutter a bit lower in this case. Plus I don't think I'll be switching the amps out as often as I do the pedals themselves, and it doesn't take too long if you just click here and disable the normals and add the new ones. Also at this point, well, I was using these Brainworks ones that don't allow IR loading. I usually use separate IRs with them, and it's not a huge issue. I would just need to add an IR loader there, but of course, like I mentioned before, that would add to the clutter, and that, like, I draw the line at that. This much clutter is fine, but more I don't want. But thankfully the ones I use now allow me to load IRs in, so don't need separate IR loaders, but it's like easily doable also if you want separate IR loaders. I think that's most of, also some explanation. You can see that effects loop 10 is before 9, and this is because I find it easier to think that 1, 2 and 3 are drive pedals, in this case governor, dozer drive and plumes. 4 and 5 are modulation, so this is the Gojira phaser. I also set, actually I don't. I usually set this wet level a bit lower because I find it's a little harsh maybe on the at full blast with distortion. But anyway, 4 and 5 are modulation, then 6, 7 and 8 are the amps, and then 9 is reverb and 10 is delay, but I like to put the delay first before reverb in this case. So that's why I put them like this. It doesn't really matter, like if you want to put this, let's say like after the amp, that's fine, it doesn't matter at all. It still works with the same button and so on, so of course the numbers only correspond to the buttons, so it's not important otherwise. Also I have wah and whammy, which are on the expression pedals, and I'm using these, you can find it in the AFAIK packages, this, I think it's called Midi Auto Engage, which basically you just set the channel that it's on, like the expression pedal works, let's see, yeah. So what this does is that when the expression pedal, like CC MIDI value goes low, it sends out another CC, so in this case 52. So what it does is that this works normally. As you can see, the pedal position is changing as I like move the pedal on the MIDI board. If I put it to 0, you can see it's bypassed. With wah, this is especially important because otherwise I would have to sacrifice one of the buttons to toggle the wah off, because it still affects the signal, of course, at like 0 position, but this automatically toggles it off, so that works well there. The whammy is the same. Hang on. Yeah, so it just toggles it off. Also, of course, you can use it as a volume pedal. What's this? Hang on. Yeah, here it is. And of course, if you're using the volume pedal, you would of course disable the whammy, which I have on the same pedal. Or alternatively, there's this preset switching button on the MIDI board, so you could just switch a preset, maybe even have all the other buttons be the same, but just change the MIDI CC for volume pedal, so you could also toggle back the volume pedal. And of course you can also set this to be at any point you want. You can use it before the amp, after the amp, in the FX loop, whatever, it doesn't matter. And you can even have two volume pedals at the same time, before and after. So if you don't like using your guitar volume knob, or alternatively, since the volume knob usually isn't a direct volume but also has an effect on the tone, if you use a volume pedal, that is only volume. And one other thing you can do with the expression pedal that I find rather useful is that you can use it on if the pedal, let's see, I've used it with Crush Station, which basically is an octaver, and it has its own mix parameter, so you can set the expression pedal to mix. I can even show, it's pretty easy. There you go. So you can fade in or use a little bit of it, or just full blast and then disable, or of course you can just set it to 100 and put it in one of the FX loops, but using it sort of with the mix with some effects can be useful, and in that case you don't even need the auto engage in there, because it's you can, if you set it to 0, it doesn't matter if it's bypassed, because it's not affecting the signal anyway, so you don't need to do this. By the way, if someone is using this auto engage, I found that you need to do it so that for example here, you need to first do the MIDI link for whatever it was, 52 or whatever, and then set it to the bypass button, and then you need to do the MIDI learn for the pedal position thing, because I couldn't get it to work otherwise. It doesn't, I can see that it sends out the CC53 in this case, but it doesn't work with MIDI learn for whatever reason, so you need to manually set it from somewhere here. I think you maybe need to press that and then go to, yeah, you can see here it's MIDI link, but that's how you need to set that up. Let's see. So I think that's most of the things explained. Then I have some EQ, and TOD is sort of an automatic EQ, a bit like Gullfoss, and then a limiter at the end. So nothing else. So the upside of this is that you get the whole pedal board and sort of the traditional workflow. And if you're playing and you're sort of feeling the music, but you'd like to add some effect or whatever, you don't need to stop playing and mess with your mouse and add the effect and set it up and whatnot, because you have everything you've already set up right there. So it doesn't disturb your workflow, so to say, at all. I think that's the nice part about it. And of course, guitarists have been using pedal boards for ages. This doesn't quite work like sort of modular pedals, which are usually now very common, where you can switch the presets and everything changes at one. I think you would need to set up maybe separate tracks for that, or separate projects or something, but this doesn't really work with that as well. And on the downsides, I feel like one downside is that this effect list is so long and ugly. And also, if you with neural DSP plugins it's fine, but if I go here, it doesn't even show all of them, which is a bit annoying. but it's not really a huge issue because you don't do, at least I don't do changes here all the time. Just like maybe add something or remove something and then I play a while and so on. Also one issue is that it takes up a lot of CPU. I'm using 64 sample buffer and it's taking up over 5% of the CPU, which is not itself that much, but I start to get drops if I have other programs running and I have a Ryzen 5600. It's so, like, because of the low buffer, it's quite sensitive, and because I have tons of, even though I don't think these FX Lob plugins really take up any CPU, but just because I have 3 amps at the same time and so much. And also because I have the chorus here, which I can actually play you a bit. I can show. Hopefully. It's probably a bit quiet because I need to keep the volume low in OBS or it will start distorting for some reason. Ah, yeah, sorry, the volume pedal was on. And then I have, let's see, these two, yeah. Okay, now it's clean. So that's the clean sound. And then if I add the really nice chorus from Fuse Audio Labs, but if I set this to mono, it doesn't really do anything. Actually, it just drops the volume a tiny bit. So I have to run, I really like the sound of this, so I need to run them all in stereo mode, which of course takes up like twice the CPU, which is also why I'm not running high oversampling to help with that. I think the Nembrine automatically does stereo if it notices a stereo signal or something like that. But yeah, it takes up a lot of CPU, and I think it would probably work fine with a lower CPU or like a older PC. Like, it depends on the plugins you use and the settings you use, and of course I could set the chorus to be after the amp, which actually I think most people maybe prefer, but I think it sounds nice like this. But then I would be able to set things to mono and still get the stereo. Well, I can't use that, but you can see it already dropped to 4%. So that's like a huge difference. But yeah, that's one thing to keep in mind. But like I said, like if you were a bit tactical about it and won't use the heaviest programs, it should work fine. Another thing is that I think one of the great things about playing in a DAW is that if you come up with a nice riff or chord progression or part or whatever, you can just hit record and then record it and save it somewhere. But of course, if your guitar track is gonna be a mess like this, if you wanna turn that into a demo or a full song, you will need to clean it up afterwards. But of course, if there's some things you don't use, you can just throw them away right away. So it's not a huge issue, but it's also not like, well, I think it's something to maybe keep in mind. Another issue is that I think I can show you with this. Yeah, so actually I'm not sure, it happened with Bass Dude at least, but let's see, here's the clean amp. If I use the bridge pickup, I have it set so that if I use the neck split, it's, especially if I roll the volume down, it's really nice and clean, maybe a bit dirty. But yeah, if I go to the bridge pickup, And then let's say I add the delta drive. Maybe try the plumes too at the same time. Yeah, this doesn't show it perfectly, but there can be, especially I think with the bass dude, there can be a big volume difference between just going clean, especially if you roll down the volume a little bit and compared to using a few pedals. So you pretty much need a limiter. And then another thing to keep in mind is that at least the neural DSP plugins add some latency. Dozer drive adds a little bit too. This one doesn't. But in any case, the whammy actually adds quite a bit. I think you can. Oh well, let's say the Gojira adds quite a bit. But like this sort of adds up, but I'm not completely sure how, because even if I were to, sorry, this might sound horrible. Now everything is enabled. Let's put in the one whammy too. And let's see, let's select, oh, I'm gonna have way too much gain, so this will sound bad, but I'll test the latency real quick. Yeah, I can't notice any latency even though it says like 500 samples or whatever. So I'm not sure, maybe that might be that if I add the buffer it might add it, or I'm not sure how it works, but in any case, since you have so many plugins and quite a few plugins add a little bit of latency, at least on paper, there could be some issues. But like I said, I didn't notice any, or I haven't noticed anything. And I can, at least if I go to 512 samples buffer, which actually I think if this says 448 and then you add 64 to that from the interface itself, it should be like 500. But I can definitely notice a latency at 512 samples, but I don't notice any here, so I'm not sure if it's the actual same thing or not, but it's also something to keep in mind. And usually limiters tend to add, like another I think nice free one is Loudmax, but it adds 60 samples of latency, so I rather would use FurComp, which is no latency. You can set the attack time to 0 milliseconds. Actually I use soft knee, so it's not, even though the ratio is infinite, it's not like actually a hard like brick wall limiter necessarily because of the soft knee. But then if you set it to hard knee, you can I'll disable the one whammy. And let's see. Yeah, not sure if you could hear it there, but there was this bit of clipping from the limiter. It wasn't clipping on the master track, but you can hear clipping. But if it's soft knee, then it's fine. So I would recommend this, even though it's more of a compressor, but it also works as a limiter, and it's 0 latency, which is really rare for limiters. But yeah, that's about it. I'll link I can maybe do like the FX chain of this whole thing, even though I'd imagine most people won't have every plugin in here. But just as an example, so you can see, I think even if, let's see, like, okay, yeah, you can't see the routing, so I'll just add the empty like FX chain with the FX loops and the amp send and probably nothing else. And maybe separately the noise gating in the description. So that's about it. If you have any questions, you can ask them here or the Honest Amp Sim Reviews user group, and I'll try to answer. Thanks, bye.